Today's speaker is Steve Sibley. Steve is the Vice President of Global Submissions and Submission Leadership at Synchrogenix, a Certara company. He has more than 25 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry. His expertise includes regulatory writing, consulting, and clinical project leadership roles. He has significant roles in more than 50 submissions and enjoys guiding clients to successful clearance of regulatory milestones. Steve, welcome to today's event. I'll now turn it over to him to begin the presentation.
Great, thank you, Suzanne, and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules for this, and thank you, Suzanne, for the introduction. A little bit of further background. I have had the great fortune in my pharmaceutical career to have started with an organization that was working on diagnostic imaging agents, and at the time, those were ones that went from initial IND filings all the way through NDA submission and approval in as little as 3 years. Those were very quick programs, and so in the first 3 years of my pharma career, I had opportunity to be part of both the initiation of clinical development programs all the way through approvals and into life cycle management, and got to see and participate in all of that firsthand across clinical, non-clinical labeling, and that served as a great springboard and has led me into roles on submissions ever since. And so you'll hear me mention as I go through this about the importance of having experienced people on your team. Having seen the process from one end to the other obviously makes a big difference, but we'll also be touching on things that you can do even if you don't have that experience or your team is relatively inexperienced. So as Suzanne mentioned, my current role at Synchrogenix, I oversee all of our submission projects. We're handling around 30 submissions a year at this point, and have opportunity to see the whole range of therapeutic areas and different types of submissions. So I think at this point, Suzanne, if we can go to the first question. I'm going to ask all of you in terms of what your role is in your current position.
So if you go to menti.com, the code that you will enter is 590878.
All right, see, we're getting a good mix of roles and functional area representation across this audience. Obviously, more for clinical than others, and regulatory second. But that's great. That's great. All of these roles are critical, and be talking in a moment about the focus of this presentation, but we will touch on all of these. Okay, so a little bit of context and focus for this presentation. There's obviously a lot of different paths we could go down. What I'm going to focus on when I'm talking about submissions is submissions for marketing approval. I'm going to have an emphasis on clinical, and I'm going to have an emphasis on writing and document production. and an emphasis on being in a lead role, whether it's just on a document or for a function or for the submission as a whole. Obviously, there are a lot of other aspects to this. There's a lot of other types of submissions, and we can talk about any questions you have on those or any aspects of those details at the end. So, you all know that submissions tend to get done by whenever management has committed to. So if they've committed to the shareholders that it's going in December 31st, all of you have probably experienced that it's going to go in December 31st. This presentation is about how to avoid losing all of your holidays and weekends and completely burning out your team along the way to get to that point. And I'm doing this presentation because I've seen over my career, and now is something that we do repeatedly as a repeatable event with our Synchrogenics submission teams, getting to that point with a minimum of disruption to people's lives and a minimum level of stress. And I'm here to tell you that that is not a fairy tale, that a submission doesn't automatically mean giving up your holidays and your family life. But it does require that you do a lot of work, especially up front. And I'm going to focus a lot in this presentation on that upfront work. And as the image shows here, you need to look behind the curtain. You have to dig in. And if you do, then I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll agree that it isn't a fairy tale. It is something that you can achieve. Submissions also tend to kind of engender a love-hate relationship because of people's experiences, and I know, I think all of us have had bad submission experiences if you've worked on one. So if, Suzanne, we can go to our next question. This one is gauging your level of love or hatred for submissions.
So you can rate, how do you feel about submissions on a scale of 1 to 100, 100 being you love them and 1 being you hate them?
Okay, it looks like we're settling in an average there, not a completely agnostic group, but more towards the love than hate. And I presume if people were very low on this scale that they might not even have an interest in this presentation, but appreciate everyone's input. And I hope that by the end of this talk I can have moved you further along that scale towards love. Because personally, I love submissions. I love that opportunity and challenge to bring all of that information from all those different experts together. And it's a critical part of what a submission is all about, is making that all come together. But there are certainly a lot of people who've had bad experiences, and as I mentioned, I think we've all worked on ones where it didn't go well. I often hear things like, I hate submissions because everything comes in at the last minute, or people always expect the writers and publishers to make up for all the time the rest of the team wasted early in the process. Things like, why even create a timeline? No one's going to stick to it. Or submissions require you to give up holidays and weekends. If you've made these statements or hold these beliefs, you know who you are. And again, I hope that I can change your mind to some extent along the way with this presentation. A lot of these things are viewing things and looking for solutions rather than as problems. And so what are then some of the things that can get you out of this? So I wanted to summarize right up front what I found some of the keys to success are. And so I want to walk through these right now, give you a quick example of what this looks like, and then we'll dig into the process more. So some of the keys to success, things you need to do. I mentioned looking behind the curtain. You need to do your homework, and this means asking a lot of questions and really probing into the project at the very beginning. So this starts even before the kickoff meeting, certainly before you start getting into all of the data and deliveries. Ideally, that work starts 9 to 18 months before the submission date, depending on the size of the program and the scope of the submission. You need to make very detailed plans, and they'll show some examples of that later. The team needs to meet regularly, and those meetings need to result in documented minutes and actions. These allow you to hold team members accountable for their deliveries. You need to communicate relentlessly, and you need to be the calm in the storm, because there will be stormy times on the project, and you need to be in a lead role. You need to be the person who can help keep the team moving forward and not get lost in that chaos. So in terms of how this happens or what it looks like, I can tell you we've worked on a number of submissions. I've had a lead role on a number of submissions where we've been able to track from timelines that were put in place 6 to 9 months before the submission. We track all of the deliveries across all the documents, and we look at those at the end in relation to where we had projected 6 or 9 months before. And we've been quite successful on a number of submissions with delivering every one of those steps of every one of those documents within 1 to 3 calendar days of what was projected 6 to 9 months in advance. So in addition to, I should add here that in addition to having the great opportunity early in my career to be exposed to the whole process, there was another critical point in my career where I joined a new company and a team that was working on a major submission coming up in about 9 months. They shared with me the timeline, and I was looking at the timeline for the integrated summary of safety, and commented that it looked really good because there was some flexibility built in, so if something in one of the reports got delayed leading up to it, there was room to move it a week or two one way or the other as needed. And the team member just looked up at me and said, "Why would it move?" And I had never come across a team or a situation like that before, but it really opened my eyes to the potential to create a timeline and stick to it. And it requires, being able to do that requires this digging in, doing all of these key points, these keys to success along the way. But I'm here to tell you that it can be done. It does happen. It is something that you can achieve on your team. So let's walk through some of exactly how to make that happen. So I want to start with another question. This one is asking you about, in your experience, what have been some of the most effective solutions for keeping submissions on track and getting to a successful submission. So we have a few choices, options to choose from here. Better planning, more communication, more resources, better or more experienced team members, or forget it, finalizing submissions is always going to be a fire drill. All right, we've got a good mix, and I know any of you who've worked on multiple submissions will know that each of these plays a more significant role in one than another, but we've got pretty close numbers on planning, communication, and better or more experienced team members. Again, I'm hoping that by the end of this, you'll see that finalizing submissions doesn't always have to be a fire drill. So I want to start with the process. So every project has a beginning, middle, and end. I like to refer to these as a discovery phase, the drive phase, and the survive phase. And the width of the arrows here is intended to represent kind of the overall proportion of the duration of the submission project time that is within each of these stages. So if you imagine going from your kickoff meeting into shells and planning, the drafts, getting to final drafts and approvals, and then the actual submission. So I want to walk through each of these stages in some detail and again emphasize the discovery phase because that's the place where I think teams lose their way and miss out on opportunities to be more successful and have a timeline they stick to. So in this discovery phase, I kind of bucket this into three main categories. You're learning, you're establishing aspects of the program, and then you're planning it out in detail. So if we start with learning, this means learning about your team and their personalities. It obviously starts with the assignments of people to the team, but you want to learn not just who the members are, but their skill and experience levels, who is going to be most likely to be the calm in the storm versus someone who is going to help create the storm in the first place. You need to learn all of the associated processes. So what's the review and approval process? Are there templates for the documents? Are there templates for your plans, and so on? Obviously, you need to know the product, the scope of the program. For people working within pharma who may have been on this program for several years and now it's finally coming to submission, this is something you already know, but if you're in a position like I am with Synchrogenix coming in as a vendor to support a submission, this is a critical piece to pick up on as quickly as possible and get up to speed with the project team to be able to fully contribute and collaborate with them. Obviously, the type of submission and proposed indication. So I won't be going into differences between full NDA and 505(b)(2)s or generic submissions or device submissions. I'll touch a little at the end about accounting for simultaneous global submissions, but the point here is that you'll go astray if you haven't pinned down right up front what type of submission is being pursued and the proposed indication or indications. So continuing on this learning theme, especially again coming in from outside the pharma company, biotech firm, the existing documentation and plan. So maybe there's 10 clinical studies in the program and 25 non-clinical. Knowing how many of them are already final and available is critical. Has somebody already drawn up a submission plan? And so there's already been some agreements about timing and when things are expected that gives you something to build on rather than having to start from scratch. What are known or expected to be the outstanding or rate-limiting documents or data? So these are the key milestones that are going to drive that submission date and drive how much time you have at each step, especially towards the end. And then one that I find often gets overlooked and is really critical is the history of the program, especially regulatory interactions. So when I'm coming into a new submission now, one of the first things I'll do is ask for copies of all of the minutes of the meetings that have been held with FDA or EMA or others, and go back through those. If the team hasn't already, I've come across teams that have this documentation assembled and in place already, which is fantastic. But if your project doesn't have it, I highly recommend that you go through all of those minutes and create a table or summary document that captures everything that was agreed to with that health authority, and then follow up with the team to ensure that that agreement was actually followed through and implemented. And the reason I emphasize this and bring this up is because every single time I've ever been in a position to do this for a submission project, I've come across something that didn't get addressed or didn't get followed through on in the way that was agreed and needed to be highlighted. It also points very well to the last bullet item here, which is the strengths and weaknesses of the product and development program, because you've already got some regulatory input on what they were looking at and what they thought were strengths or weaknesses. But those things that are gaps or discrepancies between what's been agreed are usually something from a few years ago, team members have changed, or the landscape, standard of care, or other things have changed. And while there may be perfectly good justification for it, that change that was made to account for the changes in the patient population or standard of care or external environment may not have been communicated to the agency. And so it's something to make sure that you account for in your documentation and submission. Okay, so let's move on to establishing. So we've gone to the effort to learn as much as we can. In the course of this, you're working to establish yourself and your team. So again, especially if you're new to an organization, new to a team, coming in a vendor role, it's important to establish that credibility, that role, and that influence. Digging into and asking good questions about all of those things we covered under learning is a great way to do this. I mentioned learning about processes. So this is where you work with whatever is in place already and then ensure that there is agreement on the specifics for this submission. So you may want to create a table or grid of the reviewers and approvers for each document so that you know who they are, and so they know what their expectations are of them for those documents. You want to agree on the approval process and signatories so that everyone knows which documents need a signature and which ones just need a verbal or email approval. You want to confirm which documents require a formal audit or QA check versus just some sort of QC or quality control. And you want to confirm and allot the time needed for that QC and publishing. So often the regulatory operations, submission, publishing aspects get left out of timelines, and they shouldn't be. They need to be taken into account. That group is typically the one that gets squeezed the most at the end, but if you include them in the process and account for that time, you can help avoid that happening. So then that allows us to move into planning. So again, this is based on everything that you've learned and the things that you've established. For planning, you want to be very detailed. So I'm talking about identifying when people's vacations are, when those key milestones, that final database lock or delivery of that output, or your pre-NDA meeting is happening, and counting for all of those, and any external conflicts. So maybe all the physicians on the project attend this big disease area conference every year, and that's falling when we think we're going to need to have some key document reviews going on. So identifying that early so you can resolve it is critical. Need to plan out the reviews and meetings in the reviewers and approvers calendar. So in a few slides, I will show you an example of a timeline where we've done that. And so when you start thinking of this in terms of we're going to agree on a timeline 6 or 9 months in advance, that's very detailed. And one way of sticking to that is you actually book those reviews and book those comment resolution meetings in people's calendars. It makes it real. It makes it less likely that they will schedule conflicts with those. You can keep reminding them of those, and there's some visible reminder to them as well. And then you need to reach full agreement on that detailed plan. So that plan needs to be transparent and in front of the team so that there's buy-in and that they know that this is what they'll be held to. And so been reminded of the a saying many of you probably heard, that failing to plan is planning to fail. So if you don't have a timeline, then there's certainly no way you can expect people to follow it. And you want to make sure that you treat this timeline as something that it doesn't change unless something significant requires that. So you want to establish that right up front. So with that, Suzanne, let's go to the next question. So one of the things that obviously impacts planning and is part of the planning up front is what resource you have internally for a project and what activities or resource needs to be outsourced. So giving you kind of a scale here of 4 general quartiles of what percent of the work on your last submission was outsourced. Okay, looks like we've got the whole spread here, which is not surprising, knowing there are little biotechs out there that have to outsource virtually everything, and large pharma where it may be, especially within a particular functional area, very minimal. So I think if you're working with, if you're having discussions internally in pharma about outsourcing, know that that whole range is out there. If you're working on the vendor side, know that there are a lot of different levels of support and activity that are needed by pharma and biotechs. So let's move on. So you've done all of this planning up front in this discovery phase. So I'd like to touch on what are some of the things that are commonly trip teams up and trip up these activities. So you can watch for those at the beginning. So knowing what done looks like, and that's what I touched on initially. If you've been through the entire process and seen through submission, reg defense, and approval, and lifecycle management, it makes a big difference on this process. When you're starting out, you know a lot more about what kinds of things to watch out for because you know what done looks like. So ideally, you have an experienced team. If you have a very inexperienced team, if you're inexperienced, look around for someone within your organization, or if necessary, bring in someone externally who has that experience and can help guide your team through and watch out for these pitfalls that you can fall into along the way. So one of the things that I've been seeing more and more often recently is submission plans that schedule summary document preparation and reviews in parallel with the source document. So this is creating, whether non-clinical or clinical, it's trying to draft and review summaries while in parallel with the supporting study reports. So it can be done. I've done it, but it's very painful for everyone. There's a lot of rework and inefficiency with that. There's definitely a point where it would have been much more pleasant and efficient for the team to have separated those out, even if it meant shorter review periods or revision periods for those documents. Trying to keep the message the same across documents that are undergoing revision at the exact same time is very difficult. You want to make sure that you've gotten input from all the key groups. So you may have a core team that is limited to representation from a handful of functions, but you want to make sure you've got all of the key contributing groups participating or impacted groups, so whether it's PK, publishing, QA, and the individuals from those groups, you want them to be engaged in your team. So watch out for people who are sitting on the side and not commenting or not contributing. Try and get them engaged. A very good aspect of planning is working out messaging, such as a target product profile at the beginning of the process. My cautionary note here is I've seen some organizations go too far with that, in my view, into kind of a cottage industry where wording is being created specifically for this separate messaging document, and that wording would not work in a submission document. And so now you've created all this messaging, but you have to rework it to actually use it in the submission. So watch out for that, but that doesn't take away from the importance of having some kind of target product profile or messaging up front. You want to make sure that you're addressing dependencies. So you can't issue a full draft of an integrated summary of safety until you have the integrated pooled safety output. And that's dependent on getting to database lock on the last phase 3 study. So watch for those dependencies and make sure that you've accounted for the time that's needed to get from one step to another. And then don't give up right at the beginning. Don't plan your schedule so that it requires weekend and holiday work. Maintain those weekends as weekends and those holidays as holidays. Build your schedule in a way that doesn't require that work. If you build a schedule that requires it right from the beginning, then of course that's what's going to happen. So at least build your schedule so that you don't already require work to happen on weekends and holidays just to meet that schedule. So I mentioned I would show you what this actually looks like. So this is a screenshot of an Excel spreadsheet timeline version. That's one that I like to use because it's visual. Most, especially large pharma companies, will use Microsoft Project for planning submission timelines, but they don't get down to enough detail on most tasks, and it's very hard to visualize things, especially for a particular week, what's going on. So I like this Excel type approach. What you're seeing on the screen here is calendar dates down the left-hand side with each block of 5 days representing the work week, column for capturing holidays and vacation or other commitments, and then a column for capturing any events or meetings that are going on so that you can clearly identify when there is a meeting that the team needs to be available for. And then there would be, this is just a cut down version that fit on the slide, but there are columns for each of the documents that you might be delivering, and then color-coded for each of the steps in the process. So by doing this, it allows you to see whether your reviews are staggered, whether they overlap. If you have a day when you've got 3 comment resolution meetings scheduled at the same time, it helps you see dependencies, and you can write some of those in to make those clear to the team. And so you've accounted for all of these things. And this is the level of detail that I'm talking about getting to at the very beginning. So I would set up a timeline like this for all of the documents that the particular team is responsible for at that 6 or 9 months before the submission, ideally, and book these reviews and comment resolution meetings in people's calendars that 6 to 9 months in advance, and then hold to those all the way along to start building that expectation of accountability and that this is how this is going to work. And then we'll talk in a few minutes about what to do if, say, this database lock can't happen then and has to shift. So the next phase is referred to as the drive phase. This is the bulk of the time in the submission project. The key here is to maintain your purpose and drive to the submission date and maintain a sense of urgency because we're talking about a several months period of time or even a years of time in this stage. So this is where you want to reinforce and build upon the agreements reached up front. You want to stick to those timelines and don't let things slip because there's still time. This is a very easy thing to do. Letting a review slip 1 week at this point is not going to impact your submission date, but it sets a bad precedent for when you get to the point where you don't have that option of delaying an activity. This is where you develop the confidence and the trust with delivery. So as the team gets through those first few scheduled reviews, comment resolution meetings, other activities, and those dates are adhered to, it just builds that confidence in the team and sets you up well for that more stressful, hectic period at the end. You want to anticipate delays and flaws in the data, so pay attention to when something isn't going right, there's something coming up, and make sure that you address that. You can do that by meeting regularly, and again, documenting those minutes and actions, and not letting those actions or questions linger. So just as with the timelines, there are things that can hang around for a while without impacting the submission date, but the sooner you get them addressed, the better. And you want to communicate constantly. Keep everyone updated, and those meetings are a good way to do that, but you'll probably need additional communications in between those meetings as well. This slide is just to emphasize the communication. I think if you've ever done lessons learned on a submission, communication was probably one of the things identified as they could have been better, whether it was more frequent or more clear or more widespread. I don't think it's possible to over-communicate on a large submission project. It's so much more important for everyone to know what's going on than to try to limit awareness of things. It's critical that the team be on board and everybody know where things stand. So that brings us to the final phase, which I call the survival phase, or believing when no one else does. This is where you're getting approvals and the actual submission. So if you're in a lead role, at some point, and I've seen this on every single project, I don't think there's ever a project where you don't hit this at some point. There is a point where things are just going wrong and you're going to have to adjust and help the team through this. If you're in a lead role, you want to kind of show the way for the team. You need to stay calm, keep doing what you've been doing, provide or find extra support where it's needed, and just take one step at a time. So we know that these don't go smoothly. There's always something that happens. I've captured here my timeline's fallen and they can't get up. So we've looked at this detailed timeline. So what happens if you've got this all laid out, you've been following it very well, nothing's had to shift, and then all of a sudden something comes up in the data and this database lock has to slip a whole week. So don't panic. This timeline, even though it's very detailed and set and you want to stick to it, don't treat it as rigid and it can't bend. So one of the beauties of having this kind of detailed timeline is that it makes it very easy to see what your options are. So maybe we can cut some of this drafting time here after the tables come out, if the tables are also delayed a week, or perhaps stats can deliver the tables a little earlier, or maybe the team can accommodate some additional overlap the following week with these reviews, or this review of this other study report in this case can be cut down to fewer days so that there isn't that overlap. Those are the discussions to have. It doesn't mean that everything is thrown off and you have to move everything around. By being able to see everything together, it gives you the potential to just make some minor tweaks to address that issue that's arisen. The other problem that comes up in this survival phase is being willing to tackle and face the issue that's arisen. So I've always liked this cartoon, the lemmings going over the cliff, one of them saying, "I'd like to question the leadership on this move," and the one behind them is saying, "Shut up, you're undermining the troops." It's very difficult often to raise these things or drive a tough situation to discussion and conclusion and agreement in a team setting, but it's necessary because otherwise you will see the team go over the cliff. I know that I've seen a number of times where with Synchrogenics, we're working with a client, they like and love the job the writer is doing, but the whole team, you can see the whole team is about to go over the cliff, and what's needed is actually someone to say, hey, this is a problem over here, we need to address this, we need to make these adjustments, we need to talk through this issue, and in the long run, then you have the potential to not go over the cliff. So it doesn't do you any good to have a great team, everybody's happy, they're all doing a great job, and they all go over the cliff together. The key is to not go over the cliff. But it takes some leadership, it takes standing up and raising those issues and helping drive them to conclusion. So now on to our last question. So because all of this takes time, our last question is around how long before the submission did you hold your kickoff meeting? So the amount of planning, or perhaps it's the support your organization gives for holding kickoff meetings for these types of submission projects. So we've got several categories here, everything from you didn't have a kickoff meeting for your last submission to less than 3 months, 3 to 6, 6 to 9, or 9 months or more. I think we're still getting a few responses in, but this is looking encouraging. Everybody's had a kickoff meeting for their last submission. We've got the whole range of time frames. My guess is, again, a lot of that's probably related to the scope of the submission, but I know I've come in on submissions 3 months ahead of time when it really would have been ideal to be in 6 or 9 months or more. Okay, then I just want to make a few quick comments about simultaneous global submissions, because just about everybody is working on submissions for not just the U.S., not just Europe, not just one country. So I wanted to just highlight some of the key considerations, things to take into account. The biggest is where is the company planning to submit the submission? How many different regions or countries, which ones, and when? So if the intent is to file, say, in the U.S. and Europe simultaneously, poses very different issues for the team than if you're going to submit to FDA first and then 3 months later to Europe, because you start running into issues of cutoff dates for ongoing studies and changes in safety reporting and a whole array of things. Some of the potential differences that come up a lot across documents when submitting to multiple countries are the indication may be different because of differences in standard of care, because of differences in wording that the regulatory authority has for that indication or precedence for that. The dosage form that's planned or dosing may differ. There are clearly differences in risk management requirements, especially between U.S. and Europe. The disease description or wording may be different, so it may be discussed or viewed differently in different regions of the world. The emphasis in your documents on region-specific populations. So if you've had a global study that had centers in a bunch of different countries, for a particular country, you might have called out a particular table that focused on just the patients in that country, and you would put in a different table or an additional table for a submission to a different region or different country. As I touched on already, the studies or data included. So if you're doing a submission to the second country 3 months later, you're probably going to need a different cutoff date, and that you're going to have discussions about how to handle that in the documents, how much impact that has, how much does it affect the data and conclusions. The inclusion of the integrated summary of efficacy or integrated summary of safety in EU submissions. So this is always asked about, and I can tell you I've worked on a lot of submissions where these were included, and it's never raised any question or concern in the EU or in Canada with including those. So these are a few things to keep in mind. I didn't want to omit this from this presentation because this is something that is part of taking this into account to build into your detailed timelines. It's something you should be talking about at the kickoff meeting, not when you get down to the end of the first submission, and that's not the time to start thinking about what you're going to do for the next one. So to wrap up, I just want to go through a few of the take-home messages. I built this around those key stages in the project. So again, in that discovery phase, do your homework, ask a lot of questions. You can never ask too many questions to dig into strengths and weaknesses of the program, the history, all of the process aspects, and all about the drug and the disease and indication itself. Ideally, you have your kickoff and start that work 9 to 18 months before the submission date, and the result of all of this is detailed plans that you then make transparent to the team. During the drive phase of the project, you want to keep meeting regularly with the team, document minutes from those meetings, and follow up on those actions. That will help you hold the team members accountable, and you want to communicate relentlessly. Just keep everybody informed of as much of the activity as possible at all times. And then there's that survive phase. So as in a lead role, again, whether for a document or for a function or for the whole submission, you want to be the calm in the storm, and you'll need to speak up, especially when the worst happens, to help drive the team forward, keep them from panicking. A lot of teams, a lot of companies put emphasis on lessons learned. Ideally, this is something you gather on an ongoing basis and then finalize immediately afterwards while it's still fresh in everybody's minds. You want to document them, especially any recommendations the team would make for future submission teams. The piece that usually gets missed, that I've only seen done a few times, is to have one of your team members present those lessons learned at the kickoff meeting for the next submission. I'm sure you've all experienced what usually happens is there's all kinds of effort and priority put to creating lessons learned, and then they get filed away somewhere and no one ever sees them again. So especially if the next project is an inexperienced team, the opportunity to have someone from a recent submission within the same company or same area present the lessons learned from the last submission is a great way to build up the experience on that team and help them get off to a good start. So with that, you get to your submission. It's on time. You didn't lose all your holidays and weekends. You still have your family and have some sense of what they've been doing over the last several months, and congratulations are in order. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I'll open it up for questions.
All right, thank you so much, Steve. We'd like to encourage our audience now to submit your questions in the Q&A box for Steve. So looks like we have a first question from the audience. This is all good, but my company's management always comes in at the last minute and makes the submission process a fire drill. Any suggestions for how to handle that?
That's a really common issue. And to give them the benefit of the doubt, I mean, management is usually pulled in a million different directions. This is just one of 1,000 things they're dealing with. I think the most effective thing I've seen is, and partially because this often comes from within clinical, so I'll use that as an example, to have the lead physician on your submission project meeting one-on-one with the head of clinical in your organization, or if there's a few layers in between, to work their way up to whoever is going to be that final approver, going up as high as you need to get to the highest person that's going to be reviewing this document that you know from past experience or expect might raise significant issues at the end without having seen the documents before then. So the most effective thing I've seen is if you have a function where you expect someone high up to be raising significant issues at the end, have the lead person for that function who's on your core submission team interacting with them regularly along the way. And I've often seen this take the form of sitting down with that management individual with the first draft that went out and all of their comments, and kind of going through their comments with them to get that input. I've seen that be pretty effective in heading off a lot of last minute changes. I guess the caveat here is there are organizations that have some dysfunction, and there will be last-minute requests for things. And that's where having that detailed timeline helps show them what the impacts are of what they're asking for, and helps you get to solutions to minimize the impact of those. Yeah, these types of things do come up all the time. They are difficult.
Someone in our audience has made a comment, not so much a question. In my last submission, we discovered the value of metrics, that is, measuring the amount of time expended in different activities, reasons for time lost, et cetera. It would be very useful to develop a template for this and apply it at kickoff time.
Yeah. So, yeah, I agree with that. It's some of what we've done with these detailed timelines, where we can go back afterwards and say, X% of the days when we had particular type, so when we look at all the different tasks and exactly how they were laid out, what % of the days happened exactly as we planned them, how delayed were some of the key milestones or deliveries, and then there is definitely value in capturing along the way what things came up that threw off the timelines, required the team to rethink something or adjust. Those are good. Those are really good lessons learned and can be helpful to future teams, especially if you're working with the same kind of programs or data individuals, so you know what to watch for, and it helps in, you can even do scenario planning for what if we hit this type of issue again, how would we accommodate that?
Another question from our audience. I'm about to start a submission with a team with little or no submission experience. What do you recommend as ways that I can best help that team?
So some of the things I mentioned in the presentation about, if necessary, bringing in someone external to the team, whether within your organization or from outside, who has that experience, bringing in people within the organization who've been through a submission recently, or just identifying within the team who has what submission experience, and make sure that they're engaged and they have opportunity to raise questions or concerns or insights that they have. So you want to ensure that you've kind of elevated the people who have that submission experience and can speak to it. So certainly there are people who've been on submissions but may not have been in a role where they can really help guide the team on things to watch out for, but in general, if someone's been through the submission, they know what done looks like, and they can provide some helpful guidance to those who haven't been through one.
Looks like we have one final question from our audience. Someone would like to know, what criteria do you use to estimate the number of days needed for drafting each document?
I would say there's some general rules of thumb. It can vary depending on the organization, the process involved. I think every organization is pushing everyone to make those as short as possible, and has been for many years. I think a small study report, a phase 1, something like that, can be done in 2 weeks. You could start and a generous timeline would be 4 weeks. I think for large study reports, for integrated summaries, you really want to have a 4 to 6 or even 8 week block of time ideally. I've seen those done a lot faster than that, but you generally have to then divide up the work and put more people on it, and then ensure that you've got someone overseeing that to tie it all together so it's consistent at the end, even if there's been multiple contributors. So most organizations have some sort of general template for the amount of time they allow for drafting between when the data are available and when the first draft goes out for review. Again, it varies by process, but we're talking weeks and not days or months.
Oh, looks like we have one more question. What do you think is a credible timeline for a standard 2 pivotal study first NDA submission, from the availability of the last pivotal study's top-line results to the final submitted CTV?
Okay. I think the standard timeline I'm seeing for those things is generally in the 3 to 6 month range, with to do it comfortably, definitely looking at more like 6 months. But you can push that down to 3 without going completely crazy, depending on the overall scope of the program. You know, there's a lot of other factors that come into that you need to take into account. So just even staying within clinical, the extent to which that data is being integrated, is there a thorough QT study or something else that's coming in the middle of that? Are there pop PK analyses being done? A lot of other things that could become rate limiting or influence that timeline. But I think if you've got medium-sized 2 phase 3 studies and a fairly straightforward program, it could be 3 months from database lock to submission.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Steve, for that excellent and educational presentation, and thanking our audience for the great discussion.